Hi, I'm Emma, and I thought love conquered all. I believed that when you found your soulmate, family would celebrate with you. Instead, on the morning I said, "I do," to the man of my dreams, my parents handed me an ultimatum that shattered everything. I thought I knew about unconditional love. Choose him or choose us. There is no middle ground. 20 years later, as I stood in the marble foyer of my mansion watching them through the security cameras, begging to be let in, I realized something profound. Sometimes the family that abandons you when you're building your dreams becomes the same family that shows up when those dreams become mansions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The California sun streamed through the tall windows of our Beacon Hill Manor dining room, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table where 3 generations of Richardson wealth had been discussed, planned, and preserved. I sat, across from my parents, Robert and Patricia Richardson, my hands trembling slightly as I prepared to share the most important news of my 22-year-old life. The engagement ring on my finger caught the morning light. A simple band with a modest diamond that David had saved for months to afford. To me, it was more beautiful than any of the elaborate jewelry that filled my mother's collection upstairs. Robert sat at the head of the table as he always did, his silver hair perfectly styled, reading the Wall Street Journal with the same methodical precision he applied to everything in his life. Patricia delicately sipped her coffee from china, so fine you could see through it, her manicured fingers handling the cup like it might shatter at any moment. Everything in our house was like that, beautiful and fragile and worth more than most. People made in a year. Growing up surrounded by such luxury, I had always assumed that wealth meant security, that money meant happiness. It would take me years to understand how wrong I was. I cleared my throat softly, the sound seeming to echo in the vast room despite the thick Persian rugs and heavy drapes that should have absorbed it. Both my parents looked up at me with the same polite attention they might give to a servant announcing dinner. There was love there, I believed, but it was a conditional love, wrapped in expectations and tied to their vision of who I should become. "Mother, father," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "I have something wonderful to share with you." I extended my left hand, letting the engagement ring catch the light. "David proposed last night. We're getting married." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert slowly folded his newspaper with the same deliberate care he used for everything, the crisp paper making sharp sounds in the quiet room. Patricia's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down, the only sign that my announcement had affected her at all. For a moment, I thought they might be processing the news, perhaps surprised but ultimately happy for their only daughter. I was so naive. Robert's voice, when it finally came, was as cold as the marble floors beneath our feet. "David Chen, the mechanic." It wasn't a question. He said David's name like it left a bad taste in his mouth, like he was identifying something unpleasant he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "He's not just a mechanic, Father. He owns his own auto repair business, and he's brilliant with technology. He's developing software that could revolutionize how repair shops operate. He's going to build something amazing, I know it." Even as I spoke, I could hear how defensive I sounded, how desperately I was trying to translate David's worth into terms my father might understand. Looking back, I realized that was my first mistake. Love shouldn't need a business plan to justify itself. Patricia finally spoke, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when discussing the help or addressing someone she considered beneath. Her notice. "Emma, darling, surely you understand that this is just a phase. You're young, and sometimes young people confuse infatuation with love. This man, while I'm sure he's perfectly adequate for someone of his background, is simply not suitable for a Richardson." The words hit me like physical blows. Not suitable. As if David's character, his kindness, his unwavering loyalty, His brilliant mind meant nothing because he hadn't been born into the right family or attended the right schools. I had fallen in love with David precisely because he was everything. My family's world wasn't. He was genuine where they were calculating, humble where they were proud, hard-working where they lived off inherited wealth. "I'm not confused about anything," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I love David, and he loves me. We make each other happy in ways I never thought possible. Isn't that what matters?" Robert leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same expression he wore when evaluating a disappointing stock performance. "What matters, Emma, is the family legacy. What matters is the reputation we've built over 3 generations. What matters is ensuring that the Richardson name continues to mean something in this community. This infatuation of yours threatens all of that." "How does my happiness threaten anything?" The question burst out of me before I could stop it, raw and desperate. "How does marrying someone I love hurt anyone?" Patricia reached across the table as if to touch my hand, then seemed to think better of it. "Oh, sweetheart, you simply don't understand how these things work. When you marry someone, you don't just marry them. You marry their family, their background, their social standing. This David person comes from nothing. His family immigrated here with nothing. They have no connections, no influence, no understanding of our world. Can you imagine bringing him to the country club, to charity galas, to business dinners with your father's associates?" The worst part was that she genuinely seemed to believe she was being kind, explaining reality to a confused child. She couldn't fathom that I might not care about country clubs and charity galas, that I might value David's integrity over his ability to make small talk with her bridge partners. "David is respectful and intelligent and funny," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "Anyone who takes the time to know him would see that. And if they don't, then maybe they're not the kind of people I want to impress anyway." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Robert's jaw tightened in a way that meant his patience was wearing thin, and Patricia's lips pursed into the expression she wore when the servants failed to meet her standards. "Emma," Robert said slowly, "let me be very clear about something. The trust fund that has been set aside for you, the inheritance that represents your share of the family wealth, the connections that could ensure your comfort for the rest of your life, all of these things are contingent upon you making choices that honor the family name. If you marry this man, you will be choosing to walk away from everything we have built, everything we represent." The threat hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire, acrid and suffocating. They weren't just disapproving of my choice. They were preparing to erase me from their lives entirely if I didn't conform to their wishes. "You're asking me to choose between the man I love and my family," I said, the words barely above a whisper. "We're asking you to come to your senses," Patricia replied smoothly. "This fascination with playing at being common will pass, Emma. It always does. But the damage to our family's reputation, to our standing in the community, that could be permanent." I looked around the dining room where I had eaten breakfast every morning for 22 years, at the oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who had apparently never made a choice based on love, at the crystal chandelier that cost more than David made in 6 months. For the first time, instead of seeing luxury and security, I saw a beautiful prison. "What if I refuse?" I asked. "What if I marry David anyway?" Robert's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, something hard and final. "Then you will no longer be our daughter. You will not be welcome in this house. Your name will be removed from all family documents, all accounts, all considerations for inheritance. You will be, for all intents and purposes, dead to us." The words were delivered with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. Clinical. Detached. Absolute. Patricia nodded beside him, her face showing no emotion at all, as if we were discussing the dismissal of a servant rather than the potential loss of their only child. I sat there for a long moment, staring at these two people who had raised me, who had claimed to love me, who were now prepared to cast me out entirely because I had chosen to love someone they deemed unworthy. The morning sun had shifted, and the shadows in the room had grown longer, darker. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had changed. The illusion of unconditional love, of family loyalty, of home as a safe harbor, had been shattered as completely as if someone had thrown a stone through those tall windows. "I need time to think," I said finally, standing up from the table, on unsteady legs. "Of course, darling," Patricia said, her voice artificially bright, as if we had just discussed my preference for vacation destinations rather than the complete destruction of our relationship. "Take all the time you need. I'm sure when you've had a chance to consider everything properly, you'll make the right choice." But as I walked out of that dining room, my feet carrying me automatically toward the grand staircase that led to my childhood bedroom, I already knew what my choice would be. I had tasted real love, genuine partnership, the kind of connection that made you want to be a better person every single day. I had felt what it was like to be valued for who I was rather than what I represented. There was no going back from that, no matter what it cost me. I spent the rest of that day in my room, staring out the window at the perfectly manicured gardens where I had played as a child, where I had hosted elaborate tea parties for my dolls and dreamed of growing up, to be just like my mother. The irony wasn't lost on me. In refusing to become exactly like my mother, I was finally becoming the woman I was meant to be. That evening, I called David from the phone in my room, keeping my voice low even though I knew my parents wouldn't eavesdrop. They were too refined for such crude behavior, but I also knew they had made their position clear and expected me to comply. "How did it go?" David asked, and I could hear the hope and anxiety warring in his voice. He knew how much my family's approval meant to me, how desperately I wanted them to see in him what I saw. I told him everything, every word, every threat, every cold dismissal. When I finished, there was silence on the other end of the line, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he might suggest we wait, that he might be willing to postpone our happiness until my parents came around. Instead, he said, "Emma, I love you more than I've ever loved anything in my life, but I won't be the reason you lose your family. If you want to wait, if you want to try to change their minds, I'll wait as long as it takes." That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was making the right choice. David was willing to sacrifice his own happiness for mine, was prepared to wait indefinitely rather than force me to choose. But I didn't want to wait. I didn't want to spend months or years hoping that people who valued money over love would somehow develop the capacity for understanding. "No," I said firmly. "I don't want to wait. I want to marry you, David. I want to build a life with you. If my parents can't accept that, then that's their loss, not ours." We set the date for 3 weeks later, a small ceremony at St. Mary's, chapel with just a few close friends. I would wear my grandmother's dress, altered to fit by a seamstress downtown rather than the expensive designer my mother had always envisioned. David would wear the only suit he owned, pressed carefully and paired with a tie his sister had given him for luck. It wouldn't be the society wedding my parents had planned, with hundreds of guests and coverage in the local newspaper's society pages. It would be something infinitely more precious, a celebration of love chosen freely, commitment made without coercion, a future built on hope rather than obligation. 3 days before the wedding, I made one final attempt to bridge the gap between my old life and my new one. I found my parents in the library, Robert reading investment reports while Patricia planned the menu for an upcoming dinner party. They looked up when I entered, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been hope in their faces. "I wanted to invite you to the wedding," I said simply. "It's this Saturday at 3 o'clock at St. Mary's Chapel. I know you don't approve, but I'm your daughter, and I love you. I want you there." The hope, if it had ever really been there, died quickly. Robert set down his papers with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep and disappointed. Emma, we've been very clear about our position. If you proceed with this marriage, you are no longer our daughter. We will not be attending a ceremony that represents such a betrayal of everything we've taught you. Patricia nodded, her expression pained but resolute. We've already spoken to our attorney, darling. The paperwork to remove you from the will has been prepared. Your trust fund will be dissolved and the money redistributed to various charities. We simply cannot support this decision. I stood there for a moment, looking at these two people who had raised me but apparently never really known me at all. They were prepared to cut me out of their lives entirely, rather than spend a single afternoon celebrating my happiness. The disconnect between their version of love and actual love had never been more stark. I understand, I said quietly. I'm sorry you feel that way. But I want you to know that my door will always be open to you. When you're ready to know David, to see why I love him, to be part of the family we're going to build together, you'll be welcome. Robert's laugh was short and bitter. The family you're going to build? Emma, you're walking away from a family that has money, influence, and power to start over with nothing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Do you have any idea how difficult life is going to be for you? How hard it is to build wealth from scratch? You're throwing away everything for a fantasy. Maybe, I admitted. But it's my fantasy, and it's my choice. And I'd rather struggle with someone who loves me unconditionally than live in luxury with people who only love me when I meet their expectations. That was the last conversation I had with my parents for 20 years. On Saturday afternoon, I walked down the aisle of St. Mary's Chapel in my altered grandmother's dress, my heart breaking and soaring at the same time. My father wasn't there to give me away, so I walked alone, and when I reached David at the altar, when I saw the tears in his eyes and the absolute devotion on his face, I knew I had made the right choice. We honeymooned in a cabin David borrowed from his cousin, spending 3 days hiking and talking and planning our future. We had almost no money, no family support, and no safety net. We had each other, and we had hope. And somehow, that felt like more than enough. The first year of marriage was harder than either of us had anticipated. We rented a tiny apartment above a bakery downtown, the smell of fresh bread mixing with the sound of traffic that never quite stopped. I worked 2 jobs, waiting tables, at a coffee shop during the day, and tutoring college students in the evenings. David put in 12-hour days at his auto shop, coming home exhausted, but always with a smile for me, always interested in hearing about my day. There were moments when the weight of what I had given up threatened to crush me. When I walked past the country club where I was no longer welcome. When I saw my former friends at charity events I no longer attended. When I realized that my expensive education and family connections meant nothing in the world I now inhabited. But then David would come home with flowers he'd picked from a vacant lot, or surprise me with dinner cooked on our ancient stove, or simply hold me while I cried about missing the family that had chosen wealth over love. And I would remember why I had made the choice I made. 6 months into our marriage, David's big break came. The software he had been developing in his spare time caught the attention of a local tech entrepreneur who offered to fund its development in exchange for a partnership. It was a risk, but David's intuition told him it was the right move, and I trusted his judgment completely. We used our meager savings to help launch Chen Industries, and I took on extra tutoring clients to keep us afloat, while David poured everything into building something that could support our dreams. 2 years later, that software had revolutionized inventory management for auto repair shops across California. 5 years after that, Chen Industries had expanded into real estate development and renewable energy. By our 10th wedding anniversary, David was being featured in business magazines as one of the most innovative entrepreneurs on the West Coast, and I was pregnant with our first child. We bought our first house when I was 6 months pregnant with Sophie, a modest 3-bedroom in a good school district. It wasn't the mansion I had grown up in, but it was ours, paid for with money David had earned through his own brilliance and determination. When I walked through those rooms, hanging pictures and choosing paint colors, I felt a satisfaction I had never experienced living in inherited luxury. Sophie was born on a rainy Tuesday in March, and when the nurse placed her in my arms, I understood for the first time what unconditional love really meant. Looking down at her tiny, perfect face, I couldn't imagine any scenario in which I would choose my own comfort over her happiness, any condition under which I would stop loving her. The contrast to my parents' conditional affection had never been more stark. 2 years later, Marcus arrived, and our family felt complete. David proved to be the kind of father I had always hoped he would be, patient and playful and endlessly devoted to our children. He worked hard to provide for us, but he was never too busy for bedtime stories or soccer games or helping with homework. Our house filled with laughter and chaos and the kind of love that didn't depend on performance or conformity. As Chen Industries continued to grow, as David's innovations caught the attention of major corporations and investment firms, we gradually became wealthy in our own right. But it was a different kind of wealth than I had grown up with. It was wealth earned through hard work and smart decisions, wealth that came with the satisfaction of having built something from nothing. When we finally moved to the mansion in Hillcrest Estates, it felt like a celebration of how far we had come, rather than an accident of birth. The mansion was everything I had never known I wanted. Modern and bright where my childhood home had been traditional and dark, filled with windows and open spaces that invited the California sunshine inside. The children had rooms large enough for sleepovers and hobby spaces, and David had a home office where he could work on new projects. There was a pool where we hosted parties for Sophie and Marcus's friends, and a garden where I grew vegetables and flowers with my own hands. But the most important difference between this house and the one I had grown up in was that it was filled with genuine love. When David came home from work, the children raced to greet him at the door. When I called everyone for dinner, we gathered around the table and actually talked to each other, sharing the details of our days and making plans for the future. There were no conditions, no expectations beyond basic kindness and respect. We were a family in the truest sense of the word. Sometimes, lying in bed beside David at night, listening to the quiet sounds of our children sleeping down the hall, I would think about my parents. I wondered if they knew about David's success, about the life we had built, about the grandchildren they had never met. I wondered if they ever regretted their choice, if they ever drove past our gates and thought about the daughter they had lost because they couldn't see past their own prejudices. But mostly, I felt grateful that their rejection had forced me to discover my own strength, that their ultimatum had led me to a love more real than anything I could have imagined. I had lost the family I was born into, but I had gained something infinitely more precious. A family built on choice, on love, on mutual respect and support. 20 years after walking away from Beacon Hill Manor, I had everything I had ever really wanted. I had a husband who loved me not for my name or my connections, but for who I was. I had children who would grow up knowing that love was unconditional. That family meant support without strings attached. I had a life I had chosen rather than one that had been chosen for me. I thought my story with my parents was over. I thought the choice they had forced me to make had closed that door forever. But sometimes, the past has a way of demanding attention, of forcing you to confront the people and decisions that shaped you. Sometimes the family that abandons you when you need them most comes looking for you when they need you instead. And sometimes, the mansion you build with love and determination becomes the stage for the final act of a drama that began 20 years earlier with an ultimatum and a choice that changed everything. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in our Hillcrest Estates home. I was in the kitchen making pancakes for Sophie and Marcus before school, the familiar rhythm of breakfast preparation grounding me in the peaceful routine we had built over the years. David had already left for an early meeting with potential investors for his latest venture, kissing me goodbye and promising to be home in time for Marcus's soccer practice. The California sun streamed through our floor-to-ceiling windows, casting warm light across the marble countertops that had once seemed impossibly luxurious, but now felt like home. Sophie, now 16 and every bit as strong-willed as I had been at her age, sat at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone while mechanically eating her breakfast. She had inherited David's quick mind and my stubborn streak, a combination that made her both brilliant and occasionally impossible. Marcus, 14 and still young enough to be excited about the small things, was animatedly describing a science project involving electromagnets and seemed convinced he was going to revolutionize transportation by Thursday. I loved these morning moments, the casual intimacy of family life that my own childhood had lacked. There was no formal dining room protocol here, no rigid expectations about proper conversation topics. We talked about everything and nothing, from Sophie's concerns about an upcoming chemistry test to Marcus's elaborate theories about why his soccer coach was secretly a time traveler from the future. It was chaotic and warm and real in ways I was still learning to appreciate. My phone buzzed against the counter, and I glanced at it while flipping a pancake. An unknown number with a local area code. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another telemarketer or perhaps someone from David's business network. But something made me swipe to accept the call, balancing the phone between my shoulder and ear while I continued cooking. Mrs. Chen? The voice was hesitant, unfamiliar, with the careful pronunciation of someone who wasn't quite sure they had the right person. Yes, this is Emma Chen. I moved the pan off the heat, suddenly alert in the way that mothers become when an unexpected call disrupts the morning routine. Mrs. Chen, this is Charles Whitmore. I worked for your parents, the Richardsons, at Beacon Hill Manor. The name hit me like cold water, and I found myself gripping the phone tighter. Charles. The butler who had worked for my family since I was a child, who had been more of a consistent presence in my daily life than my own parents in some ways. Charles, I said softly, and both children looked up at the change in my tone. Sophie's phone disappeared, and Marcus stopped mid-sentence about electromagnetic fields. How did you get this number? Mrs. Chen, I apologize for calling out of the blue like this. I know it's been many years since you left home, but I felt I had to reach out. Your parents, they're not well. Mr. Richardson had a stroke 6 months ago, and Mrs. Richardson, she's been struggling to manage everything on her own. I set the spatula down carefully, my hands suddenly unsteady. 20 years of silence, and this was how I learned that my father was seriously ill. Not from them, not from any attempt at reconciliation, but from the hired help who had more compassion than the people who had raised me. How bad is it? I asked, moving away from the kitchen island so the children couldn't hear every word. He's in a wheelchair now, Mrs. Chen. His speech is affected, and his mobility is quite limited. Mrs. Richardson has been trying to handle his care, but the medical bills, the specialized equipment, the round-the-clock nursing, it's been overwhelming. They've had to let most of the staff go. I'm one of the few remaining. A complex mixture of emotions swirled through me. Grief for the father I had once adored, anger at the way they had cut me out of their lives so completely that I hadn't even known he was suffering, and underneath it all, a deep sadness for the family we might have been if pride and prejudice hadn't torn us apart. Why are you calling me, Charles? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was even quieter. Mrs. Richardson asked me to. She's been talking about you more lately, especially since your father's stroke. She sees the newspaper articles about your husband's business success, the charitable donations you both make. She knows about your children, about the life you've built. And I think she realizes what they lost when they chose to lose you. What exactly is she asking for? The question came out sharper than I intended, 20 years of hurt and rejection coloring my tone. She wants to see you, Mrs. Chen. She wants to explain things, to try to. Well, I suppose to try to make amends. She's proud, your mother. Always has been. But she's also frightened now, and alone in ways she never expected to be. I looked across the kitchen at my children, who were clearly listening despite my attempts at privacy. Sophie's expression was curious and concerned, while Marcus looked confused by the sudden tension in the room. These were my babies, raised with the unconditional love I had never received, growing up secure in the knowledge that their family would never abandon them for making choices their parents disagreed with. I need to think about this, I said finally. Charles, can I call you back? Of course, Mrs. Chen. I'll be here. And Mrs. Chen? For what it's worth, I always thought they made a terrible mistake. You were a lovely girl, and from what I can see, you've become an extraordinary woman. Mr. David seems like a good man, and your children are beautiful. I hope you know that. After I hung up, I stood in my sun-filled kitchen for a long moment, trying to process what I had just learned. My father, the imposing figure who had delivered ultimatums with the confidence of someone who had never been contradicted, was now helpless and dependent. My mother, who had valued social standing above all else, was apparently ready to swallow her pride and reach out to the daughter she had disowned. Mom? Sophie's voice was gentle, mature beyond her 16 years in the way that children of happy marriages often are. Is everything okay? I turned to face my children, these precious people who had grown up knowing they were loved without conditions, and tried to figure out how to explain a situation that still felt surreal to me. That was someone who used to work for my parents, I said carefully. My grandfather and grandmother, the ones you've never met. It seems my father is quite ill. Marcus, ever practical, asked, Are you going to go see them? It was such a simple question, but it carried the weight of 20 years of silence, of hurt feelings and stubborn pride on both sides. I had built a life without them, had raised children who didn't even really understand why they had no contact with my side of the family. David and I had created our own traditions, our own support system, our own version of family that was stronger and more genuine than anything I had known growing up. But underneath all of that, underneath the anger and the justified resentment, there was still the little girl who had once climbed into her father's lap with scraped knees, who had wanted nothing more than to make her parents proud. That little girl was grieving for the relationship that might have been, for the grandfather her children had never known, for the years of shared joy and sorrow that pride had stolen from all of us. I don't know yet, I admitted. It's complicated. Sophie, wise beyond her years, nodded thoughtfully. Because they hurt you when you married Dad. I had never hidden the basic facts from my children, though I had tried to present them in age-appropriate ways. They knew that my parents had disapproved of their father, that there had been a falling out that had never been resolved. But they had grown up so secure in their own family's love that I don't think they truly understood the depth of that rejection until now. Yes, I said simply. They gave me an ultimatum. Choose your father or choose them. When I chose love, they chose to act like I no longer existed. Marcus frowned, clearly struggling to understand how any parent could make such a choice. But that's stupid. Dad's awesome. Despite everything, I smiled. Yes, he is, but my parents couldn't see that. They only saw someone who didn't fit their idea of what my life should look like. After the children left for school, I found myself wandering through our house, seeing it with fresh eyes. The family photos that lined the hallways told the Story of 2 decades of happiness, of birthdays and vacations and quiet moments of joy. David and I on our wedding day. Young and hopeful and slightly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we were promising each other. The children as babies, as toddlers, growing and changing and becoming the remarkable people they were today. Pictures of David receiving business awards, of me at charity events, of our family at the beach and on hiking trips, and gathered around our dinner table. It was a life worth celebrating. A life that proved my parents had been catastrophically wrong about David and about what would make me happy. But it was also a life that felt somehow incomplete, shadowed by the absence of people who should have been part of these memories. I called David from his office, knowing he would be between meetings and able to talk freely. "How's your day going, beautiful?" His voice was warm and familiar, still carrying that note of genuine happiness that appeared whenever he heard from me, even after all these years. "David, I need to tell you something. I got a call today." I explained about Charles, about my father's stroke, about my mother's apparent desire to reconnect. David listened without interrupting, the way he always did when something serious was weighing on my mind. When I finished, there was a moment of silence before he spoke. "How are you feeling about all of this?" It was such a David question, focused on my emotional well-being rather than on the practical implications or the potential complications. This was why I had chosen him, why 20 years later I would choose him again without hesitation. He saw me, truly saw me, and cared about my happiness above all else. "I'm confused," I admitted. "Part of me wants to tell Charles to inform my mother that it's 20 years too late for reconciliation. Part of me is curious about what she could possibly say that would explain 2 decades of silence. And part of me—" I paused, trying to articulate the feeling that surprised me most. Part of me misses them. Not the people they became when I chose you, but the parents I thought they were before that. "What does your heart tell you to do?" "I honestly don't know." "What would you do?" David was quiet for a moment, and I could picture him in his office, probably staring out the window at the city he had helped shape through his innovations and investments. "I think," he said finally, "that you'll regret it more if you don't. Go than if you do. Not because you owe them anything, but because you owe yourself the chance to know how this story ends." That afternoon, I called Charles back and agreed to visit Beacon Hill Manor the following Saturday. He sounded relieved, though he warned me that my parents had aged considerably and that my father's condition was quite serious. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that my mother had been asking about Sophie and Marcus, wondering what kind of people her grandchildren had become. The irony wasn't lost on me. The children my parents had rejected before they were even conceived, whose very existence had been an affront to their vision of the Richardson legacy, were now objects of curiosity and perhaps even longing. Sophie and Marcus, raised with love and acceptance, had become the kind of young people anyone would be proud to call grandchildren. But that pride would have to be earned, not simply claimed by virtue of shared DNA. I spent the rest of the week trying to prepare myself emotionally for the encounter. I had David alter his schedule so he could drive with me, though we agreed he would wait in the car unless I specifically asked him to come inside. This was something I needed to face on my own first, a conversation 20 years in the making, that couldn't be rushed or mediated. On Friday night, as we sat in our living room after dinner, Sophie looked up from her homework and asked, "Mom, do you want us to come with you tomorrow?" The question touched me deeply. These children, who had no real relationship with my parents and no emotional investment in the outcome, were prepared to support me through what they instinctively understood would be a difficult experience. "Thank you, sweetheart, but I think this is something I need to do alone first. If things go well, if we're able to work through some of our issues, then maybe you'll meet them someday. But tomorrow is about trying to understand what happened and whether there's any way to move forward." Marcus, ever the problem solver, asked, "What if they're mean to you again?" It was a fair question, one I had been asking myself all week. What if this was just another attempt at manipulation, another way for my parents to try to control my choices? What if my mother's apparent desire for reconciliation was really just desperation in the face of my father's illness and their financial difficulties? "Then I'll know I tried," I said simply. "And I'll come home to you and Dad and remember that the family we've built together is stronger than anything that tried to tear it apart." Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect California day that made everything seem possible. I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that struck a balance between respectful and confident. Not the designer clothes of my youth, but quality pieces that spoke to the success David and I had achieved together. I wanted to look like the woman I had become, not the girl they remembered. As we drove through the familiar neighborhoods of my childhood, I was struck by how little had changed. The same perfectly manicured lawns, the same imposing gates, the same sense of old money and older secrets that had defined this world for generations. But I was seeing it all with different eyes now, understanding the cost of such perfect facades. Beacon Hill Manor looked smaller than I remembered, though no less imposing. The grounds were still immaculately maintained, though I noticed fewer staff members than there had been in my youth. Charles met us at the front door, older and grayer, but still carrying himself with the dignity that had made him such a stabilizing presence in my chaotic childhood. "Mrs. Chen," he said formally, then broke into a genuine smile. "It's wonderful to see you again. You look happy." "I am happy, Charles. Thank you for arranging this." He led me through the marble foyer, past the grand staircase where I had once slid down the banister when my parents weren't looking, through halls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who had never imagined their legacy would be complicated by something as simple as love. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, and yet it all felt foreign now, like visiting a museum of someone else's life. My mother was waiting in the smaller sitting room, the one that had always been her favorite for entertaining close friends. She looked older, frailer than I had expected, though she still carried herself with the rigid posture that had been drilled into her by generations of Richardson women. When she saw me, her carefully composed expression cracked just slightly, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been genuine emotion. "Emma," she said, and her voice was smaller than I remembered, less certain. "Thank you for coming." I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at this woman who had shaped so much of my early life, who had taught me about manners and expectations and the weight of family reputation. She was still beautiful in the way that money and good breeding could maintain, but there was something hollow about it now, as if the foundation beneath all that polish had cracked beyond repair. "Hello, Mother," I said, and took a seat across from her, maintaining the careful distance that had always characterized our relationship. For several minutes, we simply looked at each other, 20 years of silence stretching between us like a chasm neither of us was sure how to cross. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice carrying a tremor I had never heard before. "I've made so many mistakes, Emma. So many terrible, irreversible mistakes. It wasn't the opening I had expected. I had prepared myself for justifications, for attempts, to minimize what had happened, for the kind of careful non-apology that allowed someone to express regret without accepting responsibility. Instead, my mother seemed to be offering something that sounded almost like genuine remorse. "Tell me about Father," I said, deflecting the emotional weight of her statement while I tried to process what I was seeing. Patricia's face crumpled slightly at the mention of Robert. "He's sleeping right now. The medication makes him tired, and his speech. It's very difficult for him to communicate. The doctors say he understands everything, but getting the words out is such a struggle. He gets so frustrated, so angry at his own limitations." She described the stroke, the months of rehabilitation, the gradual acceptance that this was their new reality. As she talked, I found myself feeling genuine sympathy for what they were going through, the fear and helplessness that comes with watching someone you love diminish before your eyes. "He asks about you," she said quietly. "Not in words, but I can see it in his eyes when there's something in the newspaper about David's business or your charitable work. He keeps the articles, Emma. He has a folder full of them in his desk drawer." The revelation hit me harder than I expected. My father, who had been so certain that I was throwing my life away, had been tracking my success from a distance. The man who had declared me dead to him had been secretly proud of what his daughter had accomplished. "Why didn't either of you ever reach out before now?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for 20 years finally finding voice. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting in her lap in a gesture of nervousness I had never seen from her before. "Pride," she said finally. "Stubborn, foolish pride. We convinced ourselves that we were right, that eventually you would realize your mistake and come back to us. When you didn't, when it became clear that you were actually thriving without us, I think we were too ashamed to admit how wrong we had been. You destroyed my relationship with my own family because David wasn't rich enough for you," I said, 20 years of hurt finally finding expression. "You never even tried to know him, to see what kind of man he was. You just decided that his background made him unworthy of your daughter." "I know," Patricia said, and there were tears in her eyes now, the first genuine emotion I had seen from her since I was a child. "I know how wrong we were. David, your husband, has proven to be everything we should have hoped for in a son-in-law. He's successful. He's devoted to you. He's raised beautiful children. He's everything we were too blind to see 20 years ago." It was an admission I had never expected to hear, an acknowledgement of the magnitude of their mistake that went beyond what I had thought my mother was capable of. But even as part of me felt vindicated, another part felt only sadness for all the years we had lost, all the joy we might have shared if pride hadn't stood in the way. "Do you know that your grandchildren don't even really understand why they've never met you?" I asked. "They can't comprehend how parents could choose reputation over love, how family could be conditional on approval of life choices." Patricia winced as if I had struck her. "What are they like? Sophie and Marcus?" Despite everything, I found myself smiling as I thought about my children. Sophie is brilliant and stubborn and determined to change the world. She wants to be an environmental engineer, and she's already started a recycling program at her school. That's been adopted by the entire district. Marcus is sweet and funny and curious about everything. He builds robots in his spare time and volunteers at the animal shelter every weekend. "They sound wonderful," Patricia said softly. "They sound like they have the best of both of you." "They do. They're growing up knowing they're loved unconditionally, that their family will support them no matter what choices they make as long as those choices don't hurt other people. They're confident and secure in ways I never was at their age." The implicit criticism hung in the air between us, but Patricia didn't flinch from it. Instead, she nodded slowly, accepting the judgment that was both fair and devastating. "I want to meet them," she said. "I want to try to be the grandmother I should have been from the beginning. I know I have no right to ask. I know I haven't earned the privilege, but I'm hoping you might give me a chance to try." It was the question I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Part of me wanted to protect my children from the people who had hurt me so deeply, to shield them from the conditional love and rigid expectations that had shaped my own childhood. But another part of me recognized that Sophie and Marcus were strong enough, secure enough in their own worth, to handle meeting their grandparents without being damaged by the encounter. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "But Mother, I need you to understand something. If you meet my children, if you become part of their lives, it has to be because you genuinely want to know them, not because you're trying to ease your own guilt or find some way to control our family's choices. They deserve better than that. I understand, Patricia said quickly. Emma, I want you to know that I'm not dying. I'm not reaching out because I'm afraid of running out of time. Though your father's condition has certainly made me realize how precious time is. I'm reaching out because I finally understand what I lost when I chose pride over love. I lost my daughter, my family, my chance to be part of something beautiful and real. Before I could respond, we heard movement in the hallway, and Charles appeared in the doorway, pushing a wheelchair. My father sat slumped to one side, his face showing the telltale effects of his stroke, but his eyes were alert and focused on me with an intensity that was both familiar and heartbreaking. Emma? He said, the word slurred but unmistakable, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. Looking at this diminished version of the man who had once seemed so powerful, so certain of his authority and judgment, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that time and suffering had a way of putting things in perspective. This was my father, flawed and proud and wrong about so many things, but still the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle and read me bedtime stories and told me I could be anything I wanted to be, right up until I wanted to be something he couldn't accept. Hello, Father, I said gently, moving closer to his wheelchair. I'm glad to see you. He reached out with his good hand, and after a moment's hesitation, I took it. His grip was weak but insistent, and he held on as if afraid. I might disappear again. Sorry, he managed to say, the word requiring obvious effort. So sorry. And in that moment, sitting in the house where I had learned both love and rejection, holding the hand of the man who had given me life and then tried to control it, I realized that forgiveness wasn't something I had to decide on immediately. It was something that could grow over time, carefully and cautiously, built on new experiences rather than old hurts. The conversation that followed was halting and emotional, 20 years of silence broken by careful words and tentative hopes. My parents asked about David, about our business, about the life we had built. They expressed genuine admiration for what we had accomplished and deep regret for not being part of it. Most importantly, they seemed to finally understand that their daughter had not thrown her life away for love, but had chosen love as the foundation for building something extraordinary. When I finally left Beacon Hill Manor that afternoon, David was waiting for me in the car, patient and understanding as always. He took one look at my face and pulled me into his arms without saying a word, letting me cry out 20 years of complicated emotions against his shoulder. How do you feel? He asked when I had composed myself enough to speak. Sad, I said honestly. Sad for all the time we lost. Sad for the pain everyone went through. Sad for our children who could have known their grandparents. But also relieved, I think. It's finally out in the open. The hurt, the regret, the love that was always there underneath all the pride and stubbornness. What happens now? I looked back at the mansion where I had grown up, where my parents were probably discussing this reunion and wondering if there was any chance of rebuilding what pride had torn apart. Then I looked at David, this man who had never wavered in his love for me, who had supported every dream and weathered every storm by my side. Now we take it one day at a time, I said. We see if people can really change, if families can heal from wounds this deep. And we protect our children while we figure it out. As we drove home to Hillcrest Estates, to the house we had built with love and determination, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years. Hope that my story, with my parents, might not be over after all. It would never be the fairy tale reconciliation that movies promised, but it might be something real and healing and ultimately worth the risk. The hardest part would be deciding how much of my heart I was willing to open again, how much trust I could rebuild after so many years of protection. But I had learned something important that day. Love doesn't always come in the forms we expect, and sometimes the strongest families are the ones that survive the deepest wounds. The weeks following my visit to Beacon Hill Manor passed in a strange sort of limbo. I found myself checking my phone more frequently, wondering if my mother would call, if this fragile reconnection would continue, or simply fade away like so many other attempts at reconciliation I had imagined over the years. David watched me carefully during this time, recognizing the signs of internal struggle that I thought I had hidden so well. He never pushed me to talk about what I was feeling, but his presence was a constant reminder that whatever happened, with my parents, I had already built something solid and unshakable. Sophie and Marcus had taken the news of their grandparents' existence with the kind of casual adaptability that teenagers possess. They asked practical questions about when they might meet them, whether their grandfather would recover from his stroke, and why adults seemed to make everything so complicated. Their matter-of-fact acceptance of this sudden expansion of our family tree both amazed and humbled me. They had grown up so secure in their place in the world that the idea of conditional love was almost incomprehensible to them. It was Marcus who finally asked the question that had been hovering in the back of my mind for weeks. We were sitting around our dining room table on a Thursday evening, the remains of David's attempt at homemade pizza scattered across our plates, when he looked up from his homework with the kind of serious expression that meant he had been thinking about something important. "Mom, if your parents want to meet us, does that mean they think Dad is good enough now?" The question hit me with unexpected force, cutting straight to the heart of what had been troubling me most about this potential reconciliation. Had my parents truly changed their minds about David, or were they simply desperate enough to overlook their prejudices? Was their newfound interest in our family genuine, or was it motivated by their current circumstances and my husband's obvious success? "I think," I said carefully, "that it means they've realized they made a mistake 20 years ago. Whether that's because they genuinely understand what kind of person your father is, or because they're impressed by his success, I honestly don't know yet." Sophie, who had inherited my tendency toward blunt honesty, looked up from her chemistry textbook with a frown. "Does it matter? I mean, if they want to be part of our lives now, isn't that what's important?" It was a fair question, one that spoke to her generous heart and her lack of experience with the kind of calculated relationships that had defined my childhood. How could I explain to my daughter, who had never experienced love with strings attached, that sometimes people's motivations mattered as much as their actions? "It matters because I want to protect you both," I said finally. "Your father and I have worked very hard to create a family where you feel safe and loved no matter what. If your grandparents are going to be part of your lives, I need to be sure they understand that the rules are different now, that love in our family isn't conditional on approval or performance." David reached over and squeezed my hand, understanding immediately what I was struggling with. "We don't have to rush this," he said quietly. "We can take as much time as we need to figure out whether this is going to be good for all of us." 2 days later, my mother called. Her voice was tentative, almost shy, as she asked if she might visit our home instead of having us return to Beacon Hill Manor. The request surprised me. Patricia Richardson had never, in my memory, been the one to go to someone else. She was accustomed to receiving visitors, to having people come to her. The fact that she was willing to step into our world, to see how we lived rather than expecting us to return to hers, felt significant. "I'd like to see your home," she said when I asked why she wanted to visit us. "I'd like to understand the life you've built, the world where my grandchildren are growing up. Charles can drive me over on Saturday afternoon, if that would be convenient." I agreed, though I spent the rest of the week second-guessing the decision. Our house was beautiful, successful by any measure, but it was also thoroughly modern, and unpretentious in ways that I wasn't sure my mother would appreciate. We had family photos everywhere, children's artwork on the refrigerator, and a lived-in quality that was the opposite of the museum-like perfection of Beacon Hill Manor. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made everything feel possible. I had asked David to be present for this visit, partly because I wanted my mother to see us as a united family, and partly because I needed his steady presence to help me navigate whatever emotional landmines might emerge. When Charles's familiar black sedan pulled through our gates, I felt my stomach tighten with nerves. Through the security system's cameras, I watched my mother step out of the car and look up at our house with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was dressed impeccably, as always, but there was something different about her posture. Something less rigid than I remembered. I opened the front door before she could ring the bell, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. She seemed smaller somehow, more vulnerable, standing on my doorstep instead of receiving me in her formal sitting room. "Emma," she said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. "Thank you for inviting me." "Of course," I replied, stepping aside to let her enter. "Please come in." What happened next was something I hadn't anticipated. As my mother stepped into our entryway, as she saw the family photos lining the walls and heard the sounds of our children moving around upstairs, her carefully composed expression cracked. She stopped in front of a large photograph of our family from last Christmas, all of us laughing at something David had said while we decorated the tree, and her hand went to her throat in a gesture of surprise. "You look so happy," she said, and there was wonder in her voice, as if the concept of genuine family joy was foreign to her. David appeared at that moment, having heard the door, and I watched my mother's face carefully as she saw my husband for the first time in 20 years. He had aged well, his success adding a confidence to his bearing that had been missing when he was a young man struggling to build his business. But more than that, he carried himself with the easy contentment of a man who knew he was loved unconditionally. "Mrs. Richardson?" he said, extending his hand with a warm smile. "It's good to see you again." I held my breath, remembering the last time these two had been in the same room, the cold dismissal and barely concealed contempt that had characterized their previous interactions. But my mother took his hand without hesitation, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Mr. Chen, David, I owe you an apology. I owe you more than an apology, but I hope it's a place to start." David's response was everything I could have hoped for, and exactly what I expected from the man I had married. "We all make mistakes, Mrs. Richardson. What matters is what we do with the opportunity to make things right." I gave them a tour of the house, watching my mother's face as she took in the casual elegance of our home, the way luxury and comfort existed side by side without ostentation. She lingered in the family room, studying the built-in bookshelves filled with everything, from David's business magazines to the children's favorite novels to my collection of cookbooks. "You have Proust," she said, touching the spine of one of the volumes with surprise. "David reads everything," I said. "Literature, philosophy, science fiction, business theory. He says you never know where the next good idea is going to come from." She turned to look at him with something approaching respect. "You must find the intersection between technology and humanities fascinating." "I do," David replied, settling into his favorite armchair as if he sensed this was going to be a longer conversation than anticipated. "Some of our best innovations have come from applying principles from completely unrelated fields. Art informs engineering more than most people realize." What followed was perhaps the most surreal hour of my adult life. My mother and my husband, two people who had been on opposite sides of the most painful divide in my life, sat in my living room and had an actual conversation. Not the stilted small talk of forced politeness, but a real exchange of ideas about technology and culture and the ways in which the world was changing. I found myself watching them with fascination, seeing my mother engage with ideas in a way I hadn't witnessed since I was a child. She had always been intelligent, but that intelligence had been channeled into social navigation and the maintenance of appearances for so long that I had forgotten she was capable of deeper thought. When Sophie and Marcus came downstairs, drawn by curiosity about their mysterious grandmother, the dynamic shifted again. My children approached this meeting with the straightforward interest that came from growing up without prejudice or preconceived notions about social hierarchies. "So you're our grandmother," Sophie said, settling onto the couch with the kind of direct gaze that had been intimidating teachers since she was in kindergarten. "Mom says you didn't approve of her marrying Dad." I started to intervene, to soften the bluntness of the question, but my mother held up a hand to stop me. "That's exactly right," she said, meeting Sophie's gaze without flinching. "I was wrong about your father, and I was wrong about what would make your mother happy. I let my own prejudices and fears make decisions that hurt people I should have protected." Marcus, ever the problem solver, tilted his head thoughtfully. "But you're here now, so you changed your mind." "I realized I had made a terrible mistake," Patricia said simply. "Your father is a remarkable man. Your mother is an extraordinary woman, and you two are clearly wonderful young people. I missed 20 years of getting to know you, and I can't get that time back. But I'm hoping I might be able to be part of your lives going forward if you're willing to give me a chance." What struck me most about this conversation was how my mother spoke to my children. There was none of the condescension I remembered from my own childhood, none of the sense that they needed to perform or prove themselves worthy of her attention. She asked them about their interests, their plans for the future, their thoughts about everything from environmental policy to space exploration. Sophie, who had initially been suspicious, gradually warmed to her grandmother's genuine interest in her environmental engineering aspirations. When my mother mentioned a scholarship program that Richardson Holdings had funded for students pursuing sustainable technology, Sophie's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm she usually reserved for discussions of renewable energy. Marcus, meanwhile, discovered that his grandmother knew more about classical music than anyone else he had ever met, and they spent 20 minutes discussing the mathematical principles underlying musical composition. Watching my son and my mother bond over something as unexpected as the relationship between Fibonacci sequences and Bach's fugues, I felt something tight in my chest begin to loosen. When it came time for my mother to leave, she asked if she could hug her grandchildren goodbye. The simple request, so tentative and hopeful, brought tears to my eyes. I remembered the formal air kisses that had characterized my own childhood goodbyes, the careful distance that had always existed between my mother and displays of genuine affection. Sophie and Marcus submitted to the hugs with good grace, and I saw my mother's face transform when she held them. For just a moment, all her careful composure fell away, and she looked like what she was, a grandmother meeting her grandchildren. For the first time, overwhelmed by love and regret in equal measure. "Thank you," she said to me as Charles prepared to drive her home. "Thank you for letting me see this, for letting me meet them. Your children are remarkable, Emma. You and David have done something beautiful here." After she left, we all sat in the living room for a while, processing what had just happened. The visit had gone better than I had dared to hope, but it had also raised new questions about what kind of relationship might be possible going forward. "She's not what I expected," Sophie said finally. "I thought she'd be more, I don't know, stuffy, judgmental." "She probably was 20 years ago," I said honestly. "People can change, though. Sometimes it just takes losing something important to make them realize what really matters." Marcus, who had been unusually quiet since my mother's departure, looked up from the robot he was absently assembling. "Do you think she really wants to know us, or does she just feel guilty about what happened?" It was the question I had been asking myself all week, the fear that had been underlying all my cautious optimism about this reconnection. But watching my mother with my children, seeing her genuine interest in their thoughts and dreams, had begun to shift my perspective. "I think it started as guilt," I said slowly. "But I think it's becoming something more real than that. She seemed genuinely fascinated by who you both are, not just sorry about missing out on knowing you." David, who had been characteristically quiet during this analysis, finally spoke up. "The why matters less than the how," he said. "If she treats you both with respect and genuine care, If she adds something positive to your lives, then her original motivations become less important. It was a wise perspective, the kind of practical wisdom that had helped us build a strong marriage and a happy family. But I also knew that protecting my children from emotional harm was my primary responsibility. And I wasn't ready to let my guard down completely just because one visit had gone well. Over the following weeks, my mother began calling regularly. Not the stilted, formal conversations I remembered from my youth, but real talks about everything from current events to family history to her thoughts about the books David had recommended. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding how our household functioned, how we made decisions as a family, how we balanced work and personal life. More surprisingly, she began sharing stories about her own life that I had never heard before. She told me about the pressures she had felt as a young woman to marry well and maintain the family's social position, about the loneliness of a marriage, based more on compatibility of circumstances than genuine connection, about the ways in which she had sacrificed her own dreams and interests to fulfill the role of a Richardson wife. These conversations helped me understand, though not excuse, some of the choices she had made 20 years earlier. She had been so trapped in a world of expectations and appearances that she genuinely couldn't imagine any other way of living. My choice to marry for love had threatened not just her social standing, but her entire worldview about how life was supposed to work. The breakthrough came during one of our phone conversations when she asked me about my work with the literacy foundation that David and I had established the year before. I had been describing the program we had developed to provide technology resources to underserved schools when she interrupted me. "Emma, I want to help with this, not just financially. Though Richardson Holdings can certainly provide funding, I want to be involved in the actual work. I've been thinking about what I want to do with the rest of my life, and I can't imagine anything more meaningful than helping children get access to education." The offer surprised me. My mother had always been involved in charity work, but it had been the kind of surface-level participation that involved writing checks and attending galas rather than actual hands-on involvement. The idea that she wanted to roll up her sleeves and do real work was both encouraging and slightly suspicious. "Why?" I asked bluntly. "What's changed?" There was a long pause before she answered, and when she did, her voice was quieter than usual. "Watching you and David with Sophie and Marcus, seeing the kind of family you've built, made me realize how much time I've wasted on things that don't matter. I spent 50 years of my life worrying about what other people thought, maintaining appearances, protecting a reputation that ultimately meant nothing. I want to spend whatever time I have left doing something that actually makes a difference." It was the most honest thing my mother had ever said to me, and it marked the beginning of a new phase in our slowly rebuilding relationship. She began working with our foundation's literacy program, starting with administrative tasks, but gradually becoming more involved in program development and direct service to families. I was cautious at first, worried that this was another performance, another attempt to manipulate the situation to her advantage. But as weeks turned into months, as I watched her interact with children from backgrounds she would once have dismissed, as I saw her genuine excitement about the progress our programs were making, I began to believe that her transformation might be real. The moment that convinced me completely came during a particularly challenging day at one of our partner schools. We were implementing a new reading program, and nothing was going according to plan. The technology wasn't working properly. Several volunteers hadn't shown up, and we had twice as many children as we had expected. I was sitting on the floor of a classroom, trying to help a 7-year-old named Miguel sound out words while simultaneously troubleshooting tablet issues, when I looked up to see my mother in the corner, sitting cross-legged on the carpet with 3 children gathered around her. She was reading them a story, doing different voices for all the characters, completely absorbed in bringing the narrative to life. One of the children, a little girl named Sophia who was notorious for her short attention span, was hanging on every word. When my mother finished the story, Sophia looked up at her with wonder and said, "Can you read another one?" "Of course, sweetheart," my mother replied, and the genuine affection in her voice made my throat tight with emotion. This was not the Patricia Richardson I had grown up with, the woman who had valued propriety over connection. This was someone I was just beginning to meet, someone who had perhaps always existed underneath all those layers of expectation and fear. That evening, as we drove home together, my mother was unusually quiet. When I asked her what she was thinking about, she smiled in a way that transformed her entire face. "I was thinking about how much joy there is in being useful," she said. "In making a real difference in someone's life, even if it's just helping them discover that reading can be an adventure." I've never felt anything like that at a charity gala or a board meeting. It was then that I realized my mother's transformation wasn't just about making amends with our family. She was discovering parts of herself that had been buried under decades of social conditioning and artificial priorities. The woman who was emerging from this process was someone I actually wanted to know, someone who could genuinely add value to our lives rather than simply demanding forgiveness for past wrongs. But even as our relationship continued to improve, even as my mother became a real presence in my children's lives and a valued partner in our charitable work, I knew that the biggest test was still to come. My father's condition had been slowly deteriorating, and Charles had been calling more frequently with updates about his increasing confusion and physical decline. The question that hung over all of our progress was what would happen when my father was gone, when the catalyst for this reconciliation was no longer there to remind us all of how precious and fragile family connections could be. Would my mother's transformation survive the loss of the motivation that had prompted it? Would our rebuilt relationship be strong enough to withstand the test of grief and the practical complications that would inevitably follow my father's death? I didn't know the answers to these questions, but I was beginning to believe that the relationship we were building was worth the risk of finding out. For the first time in 20 years, I had hoped that my story with my parents might have a different ending than the one I had written in my heart all those years ago. The call that would test everything we had rebuilt came on a Thursday evening, in late October, just as the autumn light was fading through our dining room windows. Sophie was at the table working on college applications, her senior year having arrived with startling speed, while Marcus was sprawled on the floor nearby, supposedly doing geometry homework, but actually building something elaborate with the robotics kit David had bought him for his birthday. David and I were discussing plans for Sophie's upcoming college visits when my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something about the urgency of the call made me answer, despite my usual reluctance to take unknown numbers during family time. "Is this Emma Chen?" The voice was crisp, professional, with the carefully modulated tone that usually meant bad news delivered by someone trained to remain calm in crisis situations. "Yes, this is Emma. Mrs. Chen, this is Detective Martinez with the Riverside Police Department. I'm calling because we have Patricia Richardson here at the station, and she's asked us to contact you. She's been arrested in connection with an incident involving financial fraud, and she's listed you as her emergency contact." The words hit me like a physical blow, each one seeming to echo in the sudden silence of our dining room. Sophie looked up from her applications, sensing the change in atmosphere, while David moved closer, his expression shifting from casual interest to sharp concern. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" I managed, sinking into the nearest chair as my legs suddenly felt unsteady. "Your mother has been arrested on charges of embezzlement and fraud. The charges relate to missing funds from several charitable organizations where she served on the board. She's being processed now, but she's asked if you could come down to the station." My mind raced, trying to reconcile this information with the woman I had come to know over the past year. The mother who had been working tirelessly on family reconciliation programs, who had become genuinely invested in helping other families heal from estrangement, who had found purpose and meaning in service to others. How could that same person be accused of stealing from charities? "What specific charges?" I asked, My legal training from years of managing David's business contracts, helping me focus on facts rather than emotions. 3 counts of embezzlement, 2 counts of wire fraud, and 1 count of conspiracy. The amounts involved are substantial, Mrs. Chen. We're talking about several $100,000 across multiple organizations over the past 18 months. The timeline hit me like another shock. 18 months ago was right around the time my mother had begun her transformation, when she had started working with charitable organizations and seemed to be finding genuine purpose in helping others. Had her entire journey toward redemption been an elaborate fraud? Had she been using her access to these organizations to steal money while pretending to care about their missions? "I'll be there in 30 minutes, I said, hanging up before the detective could provide any more devastating details. David was beside me immediately, his hand on my shoulder as I struggled to process what I had just learned. Sophie and Marcus had abandoned their schoolwork entirely, both of them staring at me with expressions of confusion and concern. "Mom, what's wrong?" Sophie asked, her voice carrying the kind of mature worry that reminded me she would be 18 in a few months, old enough to handle difficult truths, but still young enough to be hurt by them. "Your grandmother has been arrested," I said, deciding that honesty was the only way forward. "The police say she's been stealing money from charitable organizations." Marcus frowned, his analytical mind immediately seeking logical explanations. "But that doesn't make sense. Grandma Pat has plenty of money. Why would she steal from charities?" It was exactly the question I was asking myself. Patricia Richardson had inherited substantial wealth from my father's estate, had access to more money than most people could spend in a lifetime. If the charges were true, this wasn't about financial desperation. It was about something deeper and more troubling. David squeezed my shoulder gently. "Do you want me to come with you?" I shook my head, though I was grateful for the offer. "I need to handle this myself first. I need to understand what's really happening before I involve anyone else." The drive to the police station felt surreal, like I was moving through someone else's nightmare. Just hours earlier, I had been planning college visits with my daughter and discussing mundane household logistics with my husband. Now I was rushing to bail my mother out of jail on charges that could destroy everything we had rebuilt over the past year. The Riverside Police Department was a modern building that managed to be both imposing and somehow sterile, all glass, and concrete designed to project authority without warmth. Detective Martinez turned out to be a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, the kind of police officer who had probably delivered countless pieces of bad news to families who never saw it coming. "Mrs. Chen, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, leading me to a small conference room that smelled of industrial-strength coffee and bureaucratic resignation. "I want you to know that your mother has been cooperative throughout this process. She's not denying the charges." "She's admitting to stealing money from charities?" I asked, still struggling to believe this was really happening. "She's admitted to taking funds? Yes. But she's claiming that she intended to pay everything back, that she was borrowing rather than stealing. The organizations involved don't see the distinction, especially since none of them authorize these transactions." Detective Martinez opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across the table. Bank statements, wire transfer records, organizational financial reports, all bearing my mother's name and signature. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "The pattern started about 18 months ago," the detective continued. "Small amounts at first, always from organizations where your mother had legitimate access as a board member or major donor. The amounts increased over time, and the frequency accelerated in recent months. I studied the documents, my business experience helping me understand the financial trail even as my heart struggled to accept what I was seeing. The total amount stolen was staggering, nearly $500,000 taken from organizations that provided services to vulnerable populations. Food banks, homeless shelters, programs for at-risk youth, all of them victimized by someone they had trusted. "What was she doing with the money?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. That's where this gets complicated, Detective Martinez said. We've traced most of the funds to a series of investments in high-risk financial instruments: cryptocurrency, foreign exchange trading, speculative real estate ventures. It appears your mother was trying to multiply the money quickly so she could return it with substantial interest. The picture that emerged was both heartbreaking and infuriating. My mother, apparently desperate to prove her transformation was genuine, had convinced herself that she could somehow accelerate her charitable impact by taking risks with other people's money. When those risks failed to pay off, she had taken more money, chasing bigger returns to cover her losses. She thought she was helping, I said, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. That's what she claims. She says she wanted to be able to make enormous donations to these organizations, to prove that her commitment to their missions was real. When her investments started losing money instead of making it, she panicked and tried to recover the losses with even riskier bets. It was a tragedy of good intentions corrupted by desperation and poor judgment. My mother had been so eager to demonstrate her transformation, so determined to make amends for her past mistakes, that she had convinced herself that the ends would justify the means. But good intentions didn't change the fact that vulnerable people had been harmed by her choices. "Can I see her?" I asked. Patricia looked smaller and older than I had ever seen her, sitting in the holding area wearing an orange jumpsuit that seemed to strip away all pretense of dignity or authority. When she saw me, her face crumpled with an expression of shame, so profound it was painful to witness. "Emma," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." I sat across from her at the metal table, separated by thick glass and connected only by the scratchy phone system that made our conversation feel distant and surreal. For a moment, I couldn't find any words at all. The woman sitting in front of me was simultaneously the mother I had come to know and love over the past year, and a stranger who had made choices I couldn't comprehend. "Why?" I finally asked. "You have more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. Why would you steal from charities?" The explanation that tumbled out was rambling and desperate, but it painted a clear picture of someone who had become obsessed with proving her redemption. My mother described how inadequate she had felt when she first started working with charitable organizations, how the other board members had seemed to take her presence for granted because of her family's history of large donations. "I wanted to do something spectacular," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted to make the kind of donation that would really matter, that would prove I was serious about changing my life. When I read about these investment opportunities that promised huge returns, I thought I could take some money temporarily, multiply it, and give back so much more than I had taken." "But you didn't have permission to take that money," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "Those weren't your funds to risk." I know that now. I knew it then, if I'm being honest. But I convinced myself that the greater good would justify the temporary borrowing. I told myself that when I returned the money with substantial interest, everyone would understand that my intentions were good. It was the same kind of rationalization that had probably led to countless financial crimes throughout history. The belief that rules didn't apply when the cause was noble enough. But understanding the psychology behind my mother's choices didn't make the consequences any less devastating. "The family reconciliation program you've been working on," I said. Was any of that real? Or was it all part of some larger scheme? Patricia's face twisted with anguish. "That was real, Emma. That was the most real thing I've done in my entire life. The work we've been doing, the families we've helped, the relationships we've rebuilt. That's not connected to this financial mess at all. I would never compromise that program or use it to hurt people." I wanted to believe her, but trust, once broken, doesn't reassemble easily. How could I be sure that anything my mother had done over the past year was genuine when she had been simultaneously stealing From charities? How could I know which version of Patricia Richardson was real? The devoted grandmother and passionate advocate for family healing, or the desperate woman who had convinced herself that theft was justified by noble intentions? What happens now? I asked. The district attorney is talking about a plea deal, she said. Full restitution, community service, and probably some jail time. My lawyer thinks we can minimize the prison sentence if I cooperate fully and demonstrate genuine remorse. Can you make full restitution? Yes. I'll have to liquidate most of my assets, including selling Beacon Hill Manor, but I can pay back every cent I took, plus interest and penalties. The money exists, Emma. I never spent it on myself. I just made terrible decisions about how to invest it. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering practical details about bail and legal representation, but my mind was spinning with larger questions about forgiveness and redemption. Just when I had finally learned to trust my mother again, just when our relationship had reached a place of genuine love and mutual respect, this crisis had shattered everything we had built. When I finally left the police station, after arranging for my mother's bail and connecting her with a criminal defense attorney, I felt emotionally exhausted and profoundly confused. The drive home passed in a haze of conflicting thoughts and feelings. David was waiting for me in the kitchen when I returned, along with Sophie and Marcus, who had clearly been too worried to go to bed despite the late hour. They listened in, stunned silence as I explained what I had learned, the scope of the charges, and my mother's explanation for her actions. So she wasn't trying to steal money for herself, Marcus said slowly, his engineer's mind working through the logic of the situation. She was trying to make more money for the charities, but she went about it in a really stupid way. That's essentially what she claims, I confirmed. Whether you believe that explanation is a matter of interpretation. Sophie, who had developed a particularly close relationship with her grandmother over the past year, looked genuinely heartbroken. But the work she's been doing with estranged families, that's been helping real people. I've seen the letters from families who say her program saved their relationships. I know, I said. That's what makes this so complicated. The good work she's been doing appears to be genuine, but she's also been making terrible decisions that have hurt people. David, who had remained characteristically quiet throughout this discussion, finally spoke up. The question is what you want to do going forward. Your mother is going to need support through the legal process, but you're not obligated to provide it. You've already rebuilt your relationship with her once. You don't have to do it again if you don't think it's wise. It was a fair point, and one that had been weighing heavily on my mind during the drive home. I had spent 20 years learning to live without my parents, had built a beautiful life that didn't depend on their approval or involvement. I had taken the risk of letting my mother back into our lives, and that risk had led to this devastating betrayal of trust. But as I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the family that David and I had built with love and determination, I realized that the question wasn't whether my mother deserved another chance. The question was whether I could live with myself if I abandoned her now, when she needed support most. I keep thinking about something you said a long time ago, I told David, about how the strongest families are the ones that survive the deepest wounds. Maybe this is our test. Over the following weeks, the legal proceedings moved forward with the methodical pace of the justice system. My mother pled guilty to all charges, accepted full responsibility for her actions, and began the process of making complete restitution to the organizations she had harmed. The local media covered the story extensively, focusing on the irony of a wealthy woman stealing from charities while publicly advocating for family reconciliation. The publicity was devastating for my mother's nonprofit work. The family reconciliation program she had been so passionate about was suspended indefinitely while the board investigated whether any of its funds had been compromised. Speaking engagements were canceled, partnerships were dissolved, and the reputation she had worked so hard to rebuild was destroyed overnight. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of the crisis was watching my mother face the reality that her desire to do good had led her to cause significant harm. The organizations she had stolen from were forced to cut programs and services while they worked to recover their missing funds. Vulnerable people who depended on those services suffered because of her choices, regardless of her intentions. Throughout this process, I found myself in the unexpected position of being my mother's primary source of emotional support. She had few genuine friends outside of the charitable organizations that now wanted nothing to do with her, and the social circle that had once revolved around her status as a Richardson heir was more interested in gossip than genuine care. The conversations we had during this period were unlike anything we had ever shared, stripped of pretense and social niceties by the stark reality of her situation. My mother was forced to confront not just the specific mistakes she had made, but the deeper patterns of thinking that had led to those mistakes. "I think I've spent my whole life trying to prove I was worthy of love," she said during one of our weekly visits. "First trying to be the perfect Richardson daughter, then the perfect Richardson wife, then the perfect philanthropist. I never learned how to just be myself and trust that would be enough." It was an insight that helped me understand not just her recent actions, but the rigid expectations and conditional love that had characterized my own childhood. My mother had been trapped in performance-based relationships for so long that she genuinely didn't know how to simply be authentic and vulnerable. The legal resolution came 6 months later. Patricia was sentenced to 18 months in minimum security, prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and 500 hours of community service. She was also required to make full restitution to all affected organizations and submit to regular financial monitoring to ensure she didn't have access to other people's money. On the day of her sentencing, I sat in the courtroom with David, Sophie, and Marcus, all of us there to show support despite the complicated nature of the situation. When the judge asked if my mother had anything to say before sentencing, she stood and delivered a statement that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. "Your Honor, I have no excuse for what I did. I let my desire to do good override my judgment about right and wrong, and I caused real harm to organizations that serve vulnerable people. I understand that I must be held accountable for those choices, and I accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate." She paused, looking directly at the representatives from the charities she had harmed. "To the organizations I betrayed, I want you to know that every cent will be repaid with interest, and I will spend the rest of my life working to make amends for the damage I caused. I also want you to know that the work you do matters immensely, and I'm deeply sorry that my actions disrupted your ability to serve people who depend on you." Finally, she turned toward our family. "To my daughter and her family, who have shown me more grace and forgiveness than I ever deserved, I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. I hope that someday I can prove worthy of the second chance you gave me, even though I squandered it so badly." The 18 months that followed were perhaps the most challenging period of growth our family had ever experienced. With my mother in prison, I found myself serving as the executor of her affairs, overseeing the sale of Beacon Hill Manor and the liquidation of assets needed to complete restitution payments. But more importantly, I had to decide what kind of relationship I wanted to maintain with her while she served her sentence. The easy choice would have been to step back, to protect my family from further emotional turmoil by simply waiting to see what kind of person my mother became after paying her debt to society. Instead, I chose to stay engaged, visiting her regularly and including her in our family's life through letters and phone calls. Sophie and Marcus, after extensive family discussions about trust and forgiveness, decided they wanted to maintain their relationship with their grandmother as well. These visits were nothing like the formal interactions of my childhood. Prison had stripped away all the social pretenses that had once defined my mother's identity, leaving behind someone who was learning to be genuine for perhaps the first time in her life. We talked about books, about current events, about the challenges Sophie was facing in her first year of college, and Marcus's growing interest in sustainable engineering. Most importantly, we talked about the nature of redemption and whether people could truly change. My mother was participating in extensive counseling while incarcerated, working to understand the psychological patterns that had led to her financial crimes. She was also tutoring other inmates in literacy and basic financial management, finding ways to be useful that didn't involve access to other people's money. I'm learning that the desire to prove yourself worthy can be just as destructive as not caring at all, she told me during one visit. I spent so many years trying to earn love through performance that I never developed the skills to simply accept love as a gift. When my mother was released from prison, she faced the challenge of rebuilding her life from almost nothing. Beacon Hill Manor had been sold, most of her assets had been liquidated for restitution, and her reputation in the community was permanently damaged. At 70 years old, she was essentially starting over. David and I offered her a place to stay while she figured out her next steps, converting the guest house on our property into a small apartment where she could maintain independence, while being close to family. It was an arrangement that reflected how much our relationship had evolved from the conditional love of my childhood to something more mature and resilient. My mother's time in our guest house became an opportunity for all of us to experience what genuine family support looked like. Instead of the formal visits and structured interactions of the past, she became an integral part of our daily life. She helped Marcus with his college applications, attended Sophie's environmental engineering presentations via video call, and gradually rebuilt her sense of purpose through volunteer work that had nothing to do with money or social status. Most remarkably, she and David developed a friendship that was based on mutual respect rather than social obligation. They would spend hours discussing everything from philosophy to business ethics, conversations that helped my mother understand how David's approach to success differed fundamentally from the wealth-focused mindset she had grown up with. The family reconciliation program that had been suspended during her legal troubles was eventually revived under new leadership, with my mother participating as a volunteer rather than a board member. Her personal experience with the costs of pride and the possibility of rebuilding damaged relationships gave her a unique perspective that proved valuable in helping other families navigate their own challenges. But perhaps the most significant change was in how my mother related to love itself. The woman who had once made her affection conditional on social expectations learned to simply enjoy her grandchildren's company without trying to shape them into idealized versions of themselves. She celebrated Marcus's acceptance to MIT's engineering program with the same enthusiasm she showed for Sophie's decision to spend a year doing environmental work in Costa Rica, understanding that both choices represented her grandchildren following their authentic passions. On my 50th birthday, nearly 5 years after that first phone call from Charles announcing my father's stroke, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey our family had taken. We were gathered in our backyard for a casual celebration, David grilling hamburgers while Sophie and Marcus debated the environmental impact of different protein sources, and my mother quietly helping our newest family member, Sophie's boyfriend, Jake, feel welcome in our sometimes overwhelming family dynamic. Watching this scene, I realized that the mansion we had built was more than just a symbol of David's business success, or a testament to how far we had come from those early days of struggling to pay rent. It had become the foundation for something even more valuable, a family that had learned to love without conditions, to forgive without forgetting, and to support each other through both triumph and failure. My mother, now approaching 75, had become someone I genuinely enjoyed spending time with. She was still the intelligent, articulate woman she had always been, but those qualities were now directed toward understanding and supporting others rather than maintaining social position. She had learned later in life than most people that love given freely was infinitely more satisfying than love earned through performance. As the evening wound down and our family began the familiar routine of cleaning up after a gathering, my mother approached me with a small wrapped package. "I wanted to give you this privately," she said, her voice carrying the warmth that had replaced the formality of our earlier relationship. Inside the package was a simple silver locket, antique but not ostentatious, with a small photograph inside, showing my family from the previous Christmas. But what made the gift meaningful wasn't its monetary value, but the note that accompanied it. "Emma," the note read, "this locket belonged to your great-grandmother, a woman who understood something about love that it took me 70 years to learn. She used to say that the best families aren't the ones that never face challenges, but the ones that choose to face challenges together. Thank you for teaching me what that really means. Thank you for showing me that love is not something you earn, but something you share. And thank you for giving me the chance to become the mother and grandmother I always should have been." Standing in the kitchen of the home David and I had built, surrounded by the sounds of our children laughing with their grandmother while they finished the dishes, I felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with wealth or social status. We had taken the broken pieces of a family torn apart by pride and prejudice and rebuilt something stronger and more beautiful than what had existed before. The mansion that my parents had once dismissed as an impossible dream had become the center of a family that knew how to love without limits, how to forgive without enabling, and how to support each other through both failure and success. We had learned that the strongest foundations aren't built on money or reputation, but on the daily choice to show up for each other, especially when it's difficult. 25 years after walking down the aisle of a small chapel to marry a man my parents deemed unworthy, I could say with complete certainty that every sacrifice had been worth it. David and I had built more than a business empire or a beautiful home. We had created a legacy of love that would continue through our children and someday through their children as well. And when my parents had finally shown up at my mansion, it wasn't to claim credit for my success or to demand acknowledgement of their early judgment. They came as broken people seeking healing, as parents who had finally learned that their daughter's happiness was more important than their social expectations. The story of my family's reconciliation didn't end with a perfect fairy tale resolution, because real life doesn't work that way. We continued to face challenges, to navigate the complexities of relationships that had been damaged and rebuilt, to make daily choices about forgiveness and trust. But we faced those challenges together, as a family that had learned to define love by its actions rather than its conditions. Sometimes the greatest mansions aren't built with marble and gold, but with patience and forgiveness, with second chances and third chances, with the understanding that the most valuable inheritance we can leave our children isn't money, but the knowledge that they will be loved no matter what choices they make or challenges they face. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.